We all have our ways to unwind, right? Like maybe it's curling up with a good book, or maybe you're someone who recharges out in nature.
Totally.
But what if I told you that something like BDSM could be a path to personal growth, even like healing for some?
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
That's what we're diving into today. We're setting aside those kind of sensationalized images that might come to mind.
Right.
We're going deeper. We're
Mhm.
looking at BDSM through this humanistic lens, where it's potentially about self-discovery and personal transformation.
I like it.
And get this, some studies suggest that nearly half of Belgians have at least tried BDSM-related activities. It really makes you wonder how prevalent these interests truly are.
Yeah, it's definitely eye-opening. Although, got to be careful when comparing numbers across different countries, right? The way research is done on this topic, it's all over the place.
That's true.
And plus, cultural attitudes, what people feel comfortable sharing, even anonymously, it varies a lot.
Right, right, of course. Okay, well then let's just address the elephant in the room, BDSM's history. It's got some baggage, let's be honest.
Yeah, no doubt. It's been stigmatized for a long time, and we can't ignore that. Psychiatry, for years, often saw it as a sign of mental illness.
It's true.
But the good news is things are changing.
Right.
We're shifting toward understanding. The way we think about these things is evolving, especially with modern humanistic psychology. It's a whole different perspective.
Okay, so break that down for us. What does humanistic even mean in this context, and how does it connect to BDSM?
So humanistic psychology, it's all about individual agency, that potential we all have for growth and the importance of personal experience,
Yeah.
It's seeing the whole person in their own context, not just through some diagnosis.
Right.
So when we apply that to BDSM, it means recognizing that for a lot of people, it's not about deviance or being messed up. It's about personal exploration, connection, testing boundaries, and yeah, even things like healing and self-discovery. So instead of automatically assuming it's a problem, we look at the individual's experience. How's it contributing to their well-being overall?
I see. So it's kind of a reframing of the whole thing. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
But it's also important to acknowledge, I think, that some people are going to have concerns, and rightfully so.
For sure.
We're talking about power, right? Even within something consensual. How do we make sure that power isn't being abused, that it doesn't cross the line?
You're hitting on something really crucial there, and it's exactly why consent is the foundation of responsible BDSM. It's what separates it from abuse, plain and simple.
And from what I've read, the BDSM community is really, really proactive about creating this culture of consent, right? Like, it's not just a yes or no situation.
Absolutely not. It's not a one and done thing. It's a conversation. It keeps going. We're talking clear communication, figuring out boundaries together, checking in throughout the entire experience. Some people even go to workshops specifically to learn how to navigate these encounters. That's a level of commitment to safety and respect that's honestly pretty rare.
That's amazing to hear. And then there's the whole thing with safe words, which I think most people have at least heard of, even if they don't fully get how it works in a real setting.
Safe words, they're a perfect example of the practical stuff this community has come up with to make sure everyone feels empowered and in control, especially during those intense moments.
Yeah.
Having a safe word means anyone can hit pause, rewind, even stop the whole thing. No explanations needed. That kind of safety, it's everything. It changes the whole dynamic.
It was like having an emergency brake. Right?
Exactly.
Especially things get a little too intense. And it also emphasizes that someone's well-being comes first.
You got it. And speaking of well-being, the sources we looked at, they talk about this practice of aftercare.
Oh, right, yeah.
It might seem kind of obvious given what we're talking about, but the community, they've actually formalized this idea of emotional and physical support after a scene. And I think it shows how seriously they take the potential intensity of these experiences. It's all approached with care and compassion.
It makes you realize there's a lot more nuance to BDSM than people might assume.
Yeah.
I mean, we've talked about consent, but there's this whole other aspect of it as leisure, too.
Right, exactly.
It's not always about something being, like, taboo or super intense.
And that's where it gets really interesting. It challenges that whole idea that BDSM is only about sex.
So it could be just another way to spend your free time. Like, some people join a bowling league.
Yeah.
Some people learn to knit. It can be like that.
Exactly. It can be about expressing yourself, exploring what you're comfortable with, pushing your own personal limits, but in this safe environment. And that can be really liberating and empowering, even if it doesn't involve sex at all.
So there's this whole spectrum. On one end, it could be purely recreational, just a form of leisure. And on the other end, there's this potential for deeper exploration. personal growth, even healing. It's a lot to unpack.
It really is. And that's honestly what makes it so fascinating. There's so much to explore here. The sources even mention things like confronting shame, going against societal norms, finding greater self-acceptance. That's huge.
Wow.
But it's also really important to keep in mind, BDSM isn't one size fits all. What might be empowering for one person could be really triggering for someone else.
Right. Of course, everyone's different. It's all about finding what works for you. And obviously that means informed consent and mutual respect are non-negotiable.
Absolutely.
And that actually makes me think about this idea of responsible practice.
Yeah.
Because with all this talk of exploration and pushing boundaries, it's easy to forget.
Yeah.
BDSM, like anything with these power dynamics, it needs a strong ethical compass.
Exactly. And what's good is it seems like the BDSM community recognizes that. From everything we've seen, there's a real emphasis on education, on talking openly, on creating safety. It's not just about letting loose, it's about doing it in a way that respects everyone, where well-being is prioritized.
So it's like the community is taking responsibility for creating a culture of ethical exploration.
Yes.
Which I think is something we could all probably learn a thing or two from, honestly.
Totally agree.
Okay, so we've talked about BDSM in a general sense, but now I want to get into specifics. When we talk about this as a form of personal growth and healing,
Right.
what does that really look like?
Yeah, that's a great transition.
So let's get into it. Okay, so we're back and ready to get into this idea of BDSM as a pathway to personal growth, maybe even healing.
Yeah, and at first glance, it might seem a little counterintuitive.
I can see that.
We tend to associate BDSM with, like, intensity, the
Yes.
taboo stuff.
Right.
But I think that's what makes this exploration so interesting, don't you think?
Totally. It's about challenging those assumptions.
Yeah.
Really looking at what's possible here.
Exactly. And when we do that, when we peel back those layers and we look at those core principles, there's a lot to uncover.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Like, one of the big things here is this concept of BDSM as a tool for self-discovery.
Okay.
A lot of the sources talked about how by engaging in these practices, it creates this, like, safe space, a controlled environment where people can really explore their sexuality.
Interesting.
And that can be so valuable for people who maybe have struggled with shame around sex or guilt or even just, not really understanding their own desires, their boundaries.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's not always just about the sex part, is it? I mean, we touched on this earlier, but it sounds like BDSM can also be a way to explore all these other sides of yourself.
100%.
Like, where are your limits? What are you vulnerable to? Even your relationship with power in general.
You got it. And that's where things get really, really fascinating. Because by engaging in these practices, consensually, of course, with that open communication, people can start to unpack their own baggage.
Wow.
They can work through past traumas, maybe, and ultimately cultivate a stronger sense of self.
It's like by facing those parts of ourselves that we might shy away from, those darker parts, maybe even the scary parts.
Yeah.
If we can do that in a safe way where we're in control, we can actually come out of it feeling stronger, more whole.
Exactly. You nailed it. And that's where the healing comes in, right? A lot of sources talked about confronting shame, going against those societal norms that tell us we should be a certain way, and ultimately finding greater self-acceptance.
Powerful stuff.
It is powerful because true healing, true growth, I think it comes from embracing all of who we are, the good and the flaws, everything.
Yeah. I like that. It's almost like BDSM acts as this, I don't know, this unexpected mirror. It reflects back all those hidden parts of ourselves that maybe we'd normally avoid. But by facing them head on in a safe way, with consent, that's when we can actually integrate them and move forward with more self-awareness, more compassion for ourselves.
I love that analogy, the mirror. It really speaks to how transformative this can be. And it's not about, like, glorifying darkness, right?
Right.
It's about using these experiences as a way to reflect on ourselves, to grow, and just to reach a deeper understanding of ourselves, of the world around us.
It's interesting because, in a way, it seems like BDSM embraces both the light and the shadow within us.
Yeah.
It's about exploring those edges, those places where pleasure and pain, dominance and submission, they can both exist, maybe even complement each other.
And that's such a key point, because it really challenges that binary thinking we often apply to those concepts. Like, in the real world, it's not always about good versus bad or right versus wrong. There's so much nuance, complexity, and there's room for all of it in the human experience.
Right. And it seems like BDSM, when we get down to it, it's really about embracing that complexity.
Yeah.
It's about saying, hey, we contain multitudes. We have all these different desires, fantasies, experiences, and all those parts of ourselves, they're valid. They're worthy of exploration.
Precisely. And I think that's such a beautiful message.
Yeah.
When we can be open-minded, when we can approach these topics with open hearts, it opens us up to a whole new level of understanding, not just of ourselves, but of other people too.
It makes me think about how we often hear about the importance of vulnerability in relationships, any relationship.
Yeah.
And BDSM, it kind of takes that to a whole other level. It's about choosing to be vulnerable in this very specific, intentional way.
Right.
Within this framework of trust and consent.
You're absolutely right. And I think that gets at the core of why these practices can be so powerful. It's not just about like the physical sensations.
Right.
It's about the emotional intimacy, the psychological intimacy that can happen when two people, or maybe more, when they choose to explore these parts of themselves together. In a safe and respectful way, that's key.
And that level of intimacy, that can be so healing.
It can be.
Especially for people who maybe have been hurt before, or who struggle with being vulnerable in other parts of their lives.
For sure. It can be this path to like rebuilding trust, changing those negative patterns we get stuck in, and just experiencing intimacy in a way that feels both safe and empowering at the same time.
Okay, so we've talked about self-discovery, we talked about healing, intimacy. It seems like within the BDSM community, there's a lot of potential for personal growth.
Yeah.
But what about like on a bigger scale, like for society as a whole?
Okay.
Do these practices have anything to teach us about how we view relationships or sexuality, even like power dynamics in general, how we think about power?
Ooh, that's a great question. And it takes us to this really important part of understanding BDSM in that humanistic light.
Yeah.
What's so fascinating is that the BDSM community, they kind of turn those traditional societal norms on their head. Like, look at their emphasis on consent.
Yeah.
It goes way beyond just sex. It's about respecting boundaries, respecting another person's agency in every single area of life.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Because so often we think of consent as this one-time thing. Did you say yes? Especially with sex.
Yeah.
But the BDSM community, they've created this whole culture around ongoing, enthusiastic consent. I feel like that's something we could all learn from.
Oh, absolutely. It's about that constant check-in, recalibrating if you need to, making sure everyone's needs are being met, that their boundaries are being respected throughout the entire interaction, and not just like in the bedroom, right? It's bigger than that.
Right, exactly. And what about the power dynamics?
Yeah.
Because that's something that's so loaded,
Yeah.
especially in a world where we're dealing with these systemic power imbalances already.
Right, and it's definitely something to approach carefully, with awareness. But what I find so interesting is that the BDSM community, they often approach these power dynamics with this level of like consciousness and intentionality. It's kind of rare to see elsewhere. It's like there's this acknowledgement that power exists in all relationships. And by exploring those dynamics, but in a safe way, in a structured environment, we can actually learn so much about ourselves and how we relate to other people.
It's almost like instead of pretending that power dynamics aren't there,
Right.
BDSM encourages us to acknowledge them, to work with them in a conscious way, and maybe even find ways to, I don't know, subvert those dynamics, to play with them, but in a way that's empowering for everyone involved. That's kind of radical when you think about it.
It is. It's about taking back power, redefining what it even means,
Yeah.
and exploring it, exploring those nuances in a way that can be really liberating and transformative. And yeah, like you said, potentially for society as well.
It's like all those ways that we try to fit ourselves into these boxes, the boxes that society creates for us. Yeah. BDSM is like saying no thank you to those boxes.
It totally is. It's about embracing fluidity. It's about exploring the spaces in between.
Yeah.
And it challenges that whole idea that we have to be one thing or the other. You can be both. You can be neither.
It's about being a whole person
Yeah.
with all those complexities and contradictions.
Exactly. And realizing that those complexities, those contradictions, they're not something to be ashamed of. They're something to celebrate, something to explore.
I love that. So where do we go from here? We've covered a lot. We've talked about challenging misconceptions, exploring how BDSM can lead to personal growth and even like societal change. What's the takeaway, especially for people listening who are maybe hearing some of this for the first time?
That's a great question. I think the most important thing is to come at this topic with curiosity and an open mind. The world of BDSM, it's vast, it's diverse,
Mm-hmm.
and it's not about trying to make it fit into some neat little category.
Right.
It's about seeing the human beings at the center of it, seeing that potential for growth, for healing,
Yeah.
and looking at how it challenges us to rethink those assumptions we have about relationships, about sexuality, even just about ourselves as people.
That's such a good point.
We talk about the importance of stepping outside our comfort zones, right? Well, exploring BDSM, even if it's just on an intellectual level, that can be part of that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's not about feeling pressured to like incorporate BDSM practices into your own life.
Yeah.
It's more about letting the ideas we've talked about, consent, communication, becoming more self-aware, letting those things influence how you approach all your relationships, even the relationship you have with yourself.
Yes, 100%. It's about recognizing that those core principles of BDSM, communicating clearly, being willing to negotiate and compromise, respecting boundaries, making sure everyone is safe and comfortable, those are all things that can make any relationship stronger, whether it's romantic or not.
So maybe BDSM does have something to teach all of us,
Yeah.
even if we never, ever tie a single knot.
I think that's a really insightful takeaway. The world of BDSM, it's full of surprises, and sometimes those unexpected paths are the ones that lead us to the most profound discoveries.
This has been, wow, quite the deep dive. And I think it's safe to say we've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah.
But hopefully we've given everyone listening something to think about, maybe even like spark some curiosity. What
Yeah.
are your final thoughts on all this?
I think what's important to remember is that BDSM, when it's approached responsibly, when there's that foundation of consent, it really can be a source of empowerment, of connection, even healing, like we've been talking about.
Sure.
And it reminds us that, pleasure and pain, dominance and submission, they're not these things that have to be completely separate.
Right.
And within those, what might seem like contradictions, there's a whole world of possibility.
You know, it's funny because so much of what we've talked about today, this emphasis on consent, communication, really knowing yourself.
Yeah.
Those are things that I think we could all benefit from,
Mhm.
whether we ever decide to explore BDSM ourselves or not.
Absolutely. It's like it gives us this different perspective, a different lens for looking at all our relationships, even just how we interact with people day to day.
Exactly. And that's what's so cool about, approaching a topic from this humanistic perspective. It's about understanding that the human experience, it's messy. It's complicated.
Right.
And that even something that might seem taboo like BDSM can actually teach us a lot about how we grow, how we change, how we create a better world.
It's a good reminder to stay curious, to be open-minded, and to question those assumptions that honestly might be holding us back from really connecting with ourselves and with other people.
Yeah, I love that. Because so much of the fear around BDSM, the judgment, it comes from a lack of understanding. Plain and simple.
So true. And this whole deep dive, it's really shown me that sometimes the most unexpected paths, they lead to the most amazing discoveries.
100%. And it starts with having these conversations, being willing to hear different points of view and to challenge our own ideas about things.
Yes. 1,000 times yes. So as always, we encourage everyone listening, keep exploring these ideas, seek out different voices, and most importantly, talk to each other. Have those respectful conversations, because at the end of the day, it's through open minds and open hearts we create a more understanding world for everyone. And on that note, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.